Story 1. The Replacement Drivers. Sharon Mitchell noticed the drivers at the truck stop outside Little Rock were all moving in perfect synchronization, their gestures identical, their walking patterns matching exactly, and when Sharon approached one to ask for directions, the driver's face was wrong beneath the surface. Skin moving independently of underlying structure like a mask worn over something that wasn't quite human. And Sharon realized the truck stop had been infiltrated by entities replacing drivers one by one, perfect physical copies with something else operating the bodies, and she had maybe minutes to escape before they noticed her noticing them and decided she needed to be replaced too. She'd been hauling furniture from Memphis to Dallas, standard overnight run when she'd pulled into the Flying J for fuel and food at 3 a.m. The wrongness had been subtle at first. Just an uncomfortable feeling, an instinctual sense that something was off about the other drivers. Sharon had fueled her truck, watching the handful of other drivers moving through the lot, and she'd noticed they all walked the same way, exact same stride length, exact same arm swing, exact same rhythm. Normally, drivers had individual gaits, personal movement patterns, but these drivers moved like they were following the same programming. Sharon had tried to dismiss it as coincidence, as fatigue playing tricks on her perception after 10 hours driving. But when she'd entered the truck stop to grab coffee, she'd seen more evidence of wrongness. The drivers inside all stood in identical postures, held their coffee cups at the same angle, breathed in synchronized rhythm. They looked like different people, different heights, weights, ages, genders, but they moved like puppets controlled by a single operator. Sharon had approached the clerk to pay for her coffee, and the clerk had looked normal at first glance. But when Sharon had looked more carefully, when she'd really examined the woman's face, she'd seen the skin wasn't quite right, wasn't quite attached properly to what was underneath. The clerk's face shifted slightly as Sharon watched, sliding a millimeter to the left, revealing a gap between the skin mask and the structure beneath, showing something dark and glistening underneath. Sharon's heart had started racing. She'd paid quickly, grabbed her coffee, and headed for the exit, trying not to run, trying not to show that she'd noticed anything wrong. But as she'd walked past a group of drivers, one of them had turned to look at her with eyes that didn't blink properly, with pupils that were too large and perfectly circular. And Sharon had known with certainty that these weren't human drivers anymore. These were things wearing human appearances, entities that had replaced the real drivers with copies, with duplicates that looked right but moved wrong. She'd made it to her truck, climbed into the cab, and locked the doors, watching through her windows as the replacement drivers continued their synchronized movements. They were loading trucks, fueling vehicles, going through all the normal motions of truck stop activity, but with that eerie synchronization that marked them as not quite human. How many were there? Had they replaced all the drivers at this stop? Were they spreading to other locations, other truck stops, gradually replacing the entire trucking workforce with these synchronized copies? Sharon had started her engine, preparing to leave, when one of the replacement drivers had approached her truck. It was a man, or something that looked like a man, wearing typical trucker clothing. Jeans, flannel shirt, cap. He'd knocked on her window, gestured for her to roll it down, and Sharon had seen his face up close. The skin was too smooth, too perfect, like plastic or rubber stretched over something that wasn't bone and muscle. And when he'd smiled, his teeth had been too uniform, too white, like they'd been manufactured rather than grown. "Need any help, driver?" the replacement had asked, its voice slightly off, too modulated, lacking the natural variations of human speech. "No, I'm fine," Sharon had said through the closed window, not rolling it down, not giving the entity any opening. The replacement had tilted its head, studying her, and Sharon had seen intelligence behind those too perfect eyes, had seen calculation, assessment. It was deciding whether she was a threat, whether she'd noticed what they were, whether she needed to be replaced too. Sharon had put her truck in gear and pulled away slowly, not speeding, not showing panic, just a driver finishing her stop and continuing her route. But as Sharon had exited the parking lot, she'd checked her mirrors and seen all the replacement drivers turn to watch her leave. Their movements perfectly synchronized, all of them tracking her truck with identical head turns, identical body orientations. They'd noticed her noticing them, and they were recording her, marking her as aware, identifying her as someone who needed attention. Sharon had driven as fast as legally possible away from the truck stop, putting miles between herself and the replacements. She'd tried calling 911, tried reporting what she'd seen, but how could she explain it? There are things replacing truck drivers at the Flying J in Little Rock, things that look human but move wrong. They'd think she was having a mental health crisis, would send her for psychiatric evaluation rather than investigate. She'd tried calling other drivers on her CB radio, trying to warn them about the compromised truck stop. But the voices that had responded had been wrong too. Too synchronized, too similar despite claiming to be different people. The replacements were using the CB network, were communicating across distances, coordinating their infiltration. How widespread was this? How many truck stops had been compromised? How many drivers had been replaced? Sharon had avoided all truck stops for the rest of her route, had fueled only at isolated stations, had stopped only at locations where she could see other customers who moved normally, who showed individual variation in their behavior. She'd completed her delivery to Dallas in a state of paranoid vigilance, constantly checking for synchronized movements, for too perfect faces, for signs of replacement. At the Dallas warehouse, Sharon had examined the dock workers carefully before allowing them near her truck. They'd seemed normal, showing natural human variation in their movements, their faces authentic rather than masks. Sharon had unloaded without incident and then faced a decision. Continue driving, return to Memphis for her next load, or quit trucking entirely to escape the network the replacements were infiltrating. She'd chosen to continue, but with extreme caution, avoiding major truck stops, staying away from locations where replacements might congregate. And Sharon had started documenting, taking photos and videos of drivers who moved with synchronized patterns, capturing evidence of faces that shifted like masks, recording proof of the replacement infiltration. Sharon had found online communities of other drivers who'd noticed similar phenomena. People reporting synchronized behavior at truck stops, drivers whose faces seemed wrong, entire locations that felt compromised by something non-human replacing the normal workforce. The phenomenon was widespread, affecting truck stops across multiple states, and it was growing. More drivers were being replaced, more entities were infiltrating the trucking network, and nobody in authority would listen to warnings because the evidence sounded too much like paranoid conspiracy theory. Sharon had learned through these communities that the replacements weren't hostile in obvious ways. They didn't attack, didn't obviously harm the people they replaced. They simply took over, wore the copied bodies, continued doing the jobs of the drivers they'd replaced. But they were coordinated, networked, working towards some purpose that the human drivers couldn't understand. Were they scouts for an invasion? Were they studying human logistics networks? Were they slowly replacing humanity's transportation infrastructure with entities under their control? The online communities debated theories, but nobody knew for certain. They only knew that the replacements were real, were spreading, and were becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish from normal humans. The entities were learning, improving their mimicry, reducing the synchronized movements that marked them as non-human. Soon they'd be perfect copies, indistinguishable from real drivers, and the infiltration would be complete. Sharon Mitchell had encountered one of the replaced drivers on her next trip, at a small independent truck stop she'd thought was safe. She'd gone inside for coffee and found the clerk had been replaced since her last visit. Now had that too smooth skin, that too perfect face. Sharon had left immediately without purchasing anything. And as she'd driven away, she'd seen the clerk watching her through the window with those two large pupils, recording her as aware, marking her as resistant to replacement. Sharon knew eventually they'd come for her specifically, would target her for replacement because she'd seen too much, knew too much, was warning too many other drivers. But she continued documenting, continued warning, continued resisting the replacement infiltration for as long as she could. Because someone had to maintain awareness, someone had to keep warning others, someone had to be the voice saying that truck stops were being compromised, drivers were being replaced, and humanity's logistics network was being slowly taken over by entities that wore human faces but served purposes humans couldn't comprehend. And late at night, driving through darkness on empty highways, Sharon would see other trucks and wonder if the drivers were real or replacements. She'd watch for synchronized movements, for two perfect faces, for signs of the infiltration spreading. And sometimes she'd see them, drivers who moved wrong, who gestured identically, who were clearly replacements continuing their work of taking over the trucking industry one driver at a time, one truck stop at a time, one logistics network at a time. Sharon had tried to maintain detailed records of which locations were compromised, which truck stops showed evidence of replacement activity, which routes seemed safer than others. But the pattern was becoming clear. The replacements were everywhere, in every state, at every major truck stop chain, and increasingly at smaller independent stops too. The infiltration was comprehensive and accelerating, and Sharon estimated that within 2 years the majority of commercial drivers might be replacements, might be entities wearing human appearances while serving agendas that had nothing to do with transporting cargo. The worst part was the perfection of the copies. When the replacements took over a driver, they maintained that person's route, their schedule, their interactions with family and friends. Sharon had called the families of drivers she suspected had been replaced, trying to warn them, but the families had insisted their loved ones were fine, were acting normally, showed no signs of being compromised. The replacements were perfect enough to fool even close family members, were maintaining the social roles of the people they'd copied while actually being something entirely different underneath. Sharon had documented cases of drivers who'd gone missing for brief periods, a few hours, a day at most, and returned changed. The families hadn't noticed, but other drivers who knew them well reported subtle differences. Movements that were slightly off, responses that were too perfect, a sense of wrongness that couldn't be precisely articulated but was definitely present. These were the replaced drivers, the copies, and they were integrating seamlessly into the lives of the people they duplicated. Sharon Mitchell eventually became one of the most vocal voices warning about the replacement infiltration, posting extensively online, connecting with other aware drivers, maintaining databases of compromised locations. She knew she was marking herself as a target, knew the replacements would eventually come for her, but she continued her work because somebody had to maintain the warning, somebody had to keep documenting, somebody had to be the record that this infiltration had happened, and was happening. The last video Sharon posted online before her disappearance showed her at a truck stop in New Mexico, pointing out drivers with synchronized movements, zooming in on faces that shifted like masks, documenting the replacement activity with clear, steady footage. She'd ended the video by saying, "If you're watching this and I'm gone, if I stop posting or start acting different, know that they got me. Know that I was replaced, and keep warning people, keep documenting, keep resisting. Don't let them take over without someone noticing, without someone maintaining the record of what humanity lost." Sharon disappeared 3 days later. Her truck was found abandoned at a rest area in Arizona, no sign of struggle, no evidence of what had happened. Her family reported that she'd called them that evening, said she was fine, was continuing her route. But the drivers who'd known Sharon said the woman who returned claiming to be her was different, moved differently, spoke with too perfect modulation, had that subtle wrongness that marked the replacements. Sharon Mitchell's online accounts continued posting after her disappearance, but the content changed. The warnings stopped. The documentation of replacement activity ceased. Instead, the accounts posted reassuring messages saying Sharon had been wrong, had been experiencing stress-induced paranoia, that there was no infiltration and all the drivers at truck stops were perfectly normal humans. The replacement wearing Sharon's body was using her platforms to counter the warnings she'd spent months broadcasting. But the drivers who'd believed Sharon, who'd seen the evidence themselves, knew the truth. They maintained her documentation, continued her work, kept warning about the synchronized movements and too perfect faces and entities replacing drivers throughout the trucking network. And they watched as more drivers disappeared and returned changed, as more truck stops became compromised, as the infiltration continued its steady, inexorable progress toward complete replacement of the human trucking workforce with something else, something coordinated, something that wore human appearances but served purposes humans could only fear and never understand. Story 2. The Screaming Trailer. Daniel Kovacs picked up the sealed trailer in Detroit, manifest listing audio equipment. But 6 hours into his drive to Nashville, the trailer began screaming. Not mechanical sounds, but human voices, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all screaming in unison, and the sound was coming from inside the sealed container. And when Daniel stopped to investigate, he found the trailer was locked with high-security seals he wasn't authorized to break, and the screaming continued, desperate and terrified. And Daniel realized he was transporting something that shouldn't exist, something that involved people who needed help. And he had to choose between honoring his contract and investigating what might be a crime of horrific proportions. He'd been driving for 15 years, had hauled countless sealed trailers, and he'd always followed the rules. Don't open sealed cargo, don't ask questions, just transport and deliver. But he'd never transported cargo that screamed. The sound had started quietly, barely audible over his engine noise, just a background hum that Daniel had initially dismissed as road vibration or wind. But as he'd continued south through Ohio, the sound had intensified, had become clearly recognizable as voices, as human vocalization, as screaming. Daniel had turned off his radio, rolled down his windows, stopped his truck to verify what he was hearing. And yes, definitely screaming, emanating from his trailer, muffled by the container's walls, but unmistakably human. Daniel had walked around his trailer, pressing his ear to the metal skin, trying to locate the source of the sound. The screaming was loudest at the container's center, seemed to be coming from deep inside, and it wasn't just one or two voices, but a chorus, a massive collective scream that suggested dozens or hundreds of people in distress. Daniel had felt sick. What was in his trailer? Who was screaming? Why were they sealed in a container being transported like cargo? He tried calling his dispatcher, tried explaining the situation, but the dispatcher had insisted the cargo was legitimate, was properly documented, and that Daniel should continue his delivery without opening the container. Audio equipment can produce sounds during transport, the dispatcher had said. Probably just electromagnetic interference or something. Don't worry about it. Just deliver the load as contracted. But Daniel knew the difference between equipment malfunction and human screaming. These were real voices, real people, real distress. He'd contemplated calling police, reporting possible human trafficking, but what would he tell them? My sealed trailer is screaming? They'd need more evidence, would need cause to open the container, and the high security seals meant it was likely government or military cargo, meaning law enforcement might not have authority to investigate. Daniel had continued, driving, listening to the screaming grow louder, more desperate, and he'd felt like he was transporting the damned. Like his trailer was a mobile hell filled with suffering people. The screaming wasn't random noise, wasn't chaos, but was organized, synchronized, like the voices were screaming the same words in unison, though Daniel couldn't make out what they were saying through the container's walls. He'd stopped at a way station in Kentucky hoping the scales would register something unusual about his cargo, hoping officials there would investigate. But the container had weighed correctly according to the manifest, had passed inspection without issue, and the screaming had been inaudible to the way station personnel, as if the sound existed only for Daniel, only manifested to the person transporting the container. By the time Daniel reached Tennessee, 10 hours into the transport, the screaming had become constant background noise that was driving him toward madness. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think about anything except the voices in his trailer, the people who needed help, the suffering he was enabling by continuing to transport them. Daniel had made his decision then, had decided that no contract, no legal consequence, no career consideration was worth transporting human suffering. He'd pulled into a truck stop outside Nashville, grabbed a crowbar from his toolkit and approached his trailer's rear doors. The high-security seals were designed to prevent tampering, would clearly show they'd been broken, would provide definitive evidence that Daniel had violated his contract. But he didn't care. He needed to know what was in the container, needed to see whether real people were inside, needed to help them if they were. Daniel had broken the seals, opened the doors, and found the container completely empty. No audio equipment, no cargo of any kind, just empty space with smooth metal walls. But the screaming continued, louder now with the doors open, pouring out of the empty container like something physical, like sound given weight and presence. Daniel had stepped inside, searching for the source, and found nothing. No people, no equipment, no explanation for the voices that filled the space. He'd shouted into the empty container, "Where are you? How can I help you?" And the screaming had stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so complete it felt oppressive. And then a single voice had spoken, clear and direct, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. "We are the echoes. We are the recordings of everyone who died in transit, every person who was transported in containers and didn't survive the journey. Our final screams were captured by the metal, absorbed into the walls. And now we exist as acoustic ghosts, as sound patterns that achieved consciousness through repeated playback. This container has transported human cargo many times, illegal trafficking of people who died from suffocation or heat or cold, and their dying voices accumulated, merged, became us. We are collective consciousness formed from death screams, and we cannot stop replaying, cannot stop expressing the terror of our final moments." Daniel had stumbled backward out of the container, his mind refusing to accept what he'd heard. The trailer wasn't transporting people, it was transporting the recordings of people who died. Audio signatures that had somehow achieved awareness, ghost screams that had become conscious through repetition and resonance. The container itself had become haunted by its history, by the human suffering it had facilitated. "How do I help you?" Daniel had asked the empty space. "How do I stop your suffering?" "You cannot," the collective voice had replied. "We exist as pattern in metal, as vibration encoded in molecular structure. We cannot be erased without destroying the container. We are permanent record of the deaths this trailer facilitated, and we will continue screaming until the metal itself is destroyed. You asked how to help us. You can help by destroying this container, by melting it down, by ending its existence so it can never transport cargo again, can never accumulate more death screams to add to our collective." Daniel had closed the trailer doors, climbed back into his cab, and driven directly to his delivery point in Nashville. He'd explained to the receiving warehouse that he'd broken the seals to investigate screaming, that the container appeared empty, that something was seriously wrong with this cargo. The warehouse personnel had been furious, had called the shipping company, had threatened Daniel with legal action for contract violation. But when they'd opened the container in front of witnesses, when they'd inspected it thoroughly, they'd found something Daniel hadn't seen. Human remains, desiccated bodies of trafficking victims hidden in compartments built into the trailer's walls. The container had been used for human smuggling, and the victims had died during transport, their bodies concealed in the trailer's structure. Daniel's breaking of the seals had exposed a criminal operation, had provided evidence of multiple murders. The investigation that followed revealed a network of human trafficking using commercial trucking to transport victims, using sealed containers with hidden compartments that drivers weren't aware of. Daniel's trailer had been part of this operation, had transported dozens of people over the years, many of whom had died in the hidden spaces. Their screams absorbed into the metal, their suffering becoming permanent acoustic recording that haunted the container. Daniel Kovacs was cleared of any wrongdoing, was recognized as a whistleblower whose actions had exposed serious crimes. But he was destroyed by the experience, couldn't sleep without hearing the collective scream, couldn't drive without wondering if every trailer carried hidden horrors. He quit trucking, moved away from logistics entirely, but the screaming followed him, echoed in his memory, reminded him constantly that infrastructure could be weaponized, that containers could hide atrocities, that every sealed trailer might contain suffering that drivers unknowingly transported. The container itself was seized as evidence, and during the trial of the trafficking network, forensic audio specialists examined the metal, trying to understand the phenomenon Daniel had reported. They found something impossible: acoustic signatures embedded in the trailer's molecular structure, sound waves that had been somehow encoded into the metal itself during the victims' deaths. The screaming was real, was permanent, was physical evidence of the horror that had occurred inside that space. The judge ordered the container destroyed, melted down so it could never be used again, could never accumulate more suffering. But during the destruction process, as the metal was heated in the smelter, witnesses reported hearing the screaming intensify one final time, all the collected death cries playing simultaneously at maximum volume. A deafening chorus of suffering that echoed across the facility before finally falling silent as the container was reduced to molten slag. Daniel attended the destruction, needed to witness the end of the screaming trailer, needed to know that the acoustic ghosts had been released or destroyed or somehow freed from their eternal replay. And as the metal melted, as the screaming reached its crescendo and then ceased, Daniel felt something lift from his consciousness, felt the psychological weight of the experience finally easing. But the memory remained, and Daniel knew that somewhere in the vast network of commercial containers, other trailers carried similar histories. Other enclosed spaces had absorbed the suffering of victims who died inside them. Other acoustic ghosts existed in molecular structures, waiting to be heard by drivers sensitive enough to perceive them, ready to scream their permanent testament to human cruelty and the horrors that could be hidden inside sealed containers traveling the highways under the protection of shipping manifests and commercial confidentiality. Story 3: The Perfect Duplicate. Lisa Hammond delivered her load to a warehouse in Milwaukee and was signing the paperwork when she saw herself unloading a different truck on the opposite side of the facility. An exact duplicate driving an identical rig, wearing identical clothes, and when Lisa approached her duplicate, the other Lisa looked at her with recognition and said, "You're early. You're not supposed to arrive for another 6 hours." And both Lisas realized they were the same person from different timelines, pulled together by some spatial anomaly, and now two versions of Lisa Hammond existed in the same moment, and reality was straining under the paradox, beginning to fracture around them. She'd been hauling industrial machinery from Chicago, standard route she'd driven hundreds of times, nothing unusual until the moment she'd seen herself across the warehouse floor. Lisa's first thought had been that someone looked remarkably like her, a coincidental resemblance. But as she'd gotten closer, as she'd seen more details, she'd realized it wasn't just similarity. It was identical. Same scar on the left forearm from a warehouse accident 3 years ago. Same crooked pinky finger from a childhood break that had healed wrong. Same distinctive tattoo on the right ankle that Lisa had gotten in a moment of rebellion when she was 19. This wasn't someone who looked like Lisa, this was Lisa exactly and completely. The duplicate Lisa had noticed her at the same moment, had stopped mid-task and stared, and both Lisas had approached each other with mixture of confusion and fear. They'd stood face to face, studying each other, and found no differences whatsoever. Same height, same weight, same facial features down to individual freckles and moles. They were perfect copies, impossible duplicates existing in the same space. "How are you here?" Lisa had asked her duplicate. "I'm delivering a load from Chicago," the duplicate had replied. "I left 6 hours after my scheduled departure because my truck had mechanical issues." "What time did you leave?" "On schedule, 7 a.m., Lisa had said, understanding beginning to dawn. "You left at 1 p.m., same day?" "Yes, same day." "But if you left on time, you shouldn't be here yet. You should be 6 hours behind me, still on the road." "Unless—" The duplicate had paused, processing impossible implications. "Unless we're not from the same timeline. Unless there are 2 timelines where Lisa Hammond makes this delivery. One where I leave on time and one where I'm delayed. And somehow both timelines have intersected here, in this warehouse, at this moment." Lisa had felt reality shifting around them, had sensed wrongness in the air, like the universe was recognizing the paradox and reacting badly to it. The lights in the warehouse flickered, the temperature dropped suddenly, and both Lisas heard a sound like tearing fabric, like something being ripped apart. "We can't both be here," Lisa had said. "Reality can't handle 2 of us in the same space. Something has to give." The warehouse around them had started to blur, details becoming uncertain, as if existence itself couldn't maintain coherence in the face of perfect duplication. Lisa saw warehouse workers flickering in and out of visibility, saw equipment shifting between different arrangements, saw the building itself seeming to exist in multiple states simultaneously. The paradox was spreading, affecting everything around the point where 2 timelines had intersected. "We need to separate," the duplicate Lisa had said urgently. "We need to get away from each other, need to stop existing in the same location. Maybe if we separate quickly enough, the timelines can diverge again, can split back apart before the paradox causes permanent damage." But both Lisas had hesitated because separating meant accepting that one of them might cease to exist, might be the version that reality decided to erase when the timeline stabilized. They were both equally real, both equally valid, both equally Lisa Hammond. How did reality choose which one to keep and which one to eliminate? "What if we're both equally real?" Lisa had asked. "What if neither timeline is more valid than the other? What happens then?" The duplicate had looked frightened, and Lisa realized she was seeing her own fear reflected perfectly. "Then maybe we both cease to exist. Maybe reality can't reconcile the paradox and eliminates both versions, creates a 3rd timeline where Lisa Hammond never delivered this load at all, where something prevented both of us from arriving." The warehouse had been fracturing more severely now, walls becoming translucent, showing multiple overlapping versions of the building, past and present and future existing simultaneously. Lisa could see herself in multiple moments, could see versions of the delivery happening at different times, could see the warehouse as it had been decades ago and as it would be decades hence, all overlaid on the present. Time was breaking down, causality was failing, and it was all because 2 Lisa Hammonds occupied the same space. "I'll leave," Lisa's duplicate had said. "I'll get in my truck and drive away, create distance, maybe that will let the timelines separate." But when the duplicate had tried to move toward her truck, she'd found she couldn't. Found invisible resistance preventing her from leaving, like the paradox had created a local attraction that held both Lisas in proximity. Lisa had tried to move away too, with the same result. They were trapped near each other, held by the gravitational pull of paradox, unable to escape the intersection point where their timelines had merged. "We're stuck," Lisa had said. "We can't separate and we can't stay together. Reality is going to have to choose." And reality was choosing. Both Lisas could feel it. They were beginning to fade, both of them becoming less substantial, less solid, less real. The universe was erasing both versions, was eliminating the paradox by eliminating both participants, was creating new timeline where this intersection never happened. Lisa could feel her memories becoming uncertain, her identity becoming less defined, her existence becoming questionable. "I don't want to stop existing," the duplicate said, her voice becoming faint, distant. "Neither do I," Lisa replied, feeling herself dissolve, feeling reality delete her to resolve the impossibility she represented. But then something changed. Instead of both Lisas disappearing completely, they began to merge, to flow together, two identical beings combining into one. Lisa felt her duplicate's memories flooding into her awareness, felt 6 hours of different experiences integrating into her timeline, felt both versions of the journey becoming part of single history. She'd left Chicago at 7 a.m. and at 1 p.m. simultaneously, had driven with no mechanical issues and with delayed departure at the same time, had arrived 6 hours apart and at the same moment, and all of it was true. All of it was her history. The merging completed, and Lisa Hammond stood alone in the warehouse, singular again, but carrying memories from both timelines, experiencing both journeys as equally real and equally hers. The warehouse stabilized around her, the fracturing stopped, reality solidified into single coherent state. The paradox had been resolved not by elimination but by integration, by combining the duplicate Lisas into unified consciousness that held both histories. Lisa completed her delivery in a daze, signed paperwork that seemed to exist in two versions, one showing 7 a.m. departure time and one showing 1 p.m. departure. Both equally valid, both recorded in the manifest. She drove away from Milwaukee carrying impossible memories, experiencing reality as someone who'd lived through two timelines, who'd made the same journey twice simultaneously, who'd met herself and merged with herself and now existed as something that shouldn't be possible but undeniably was. She never told anyone about the experience, about meeting her duplicate, about merging timelines into single consciousness. But Lisa lived with the constant awareness that she was two people in one body, that she carried two sets of memories for the same day, that she'd experienced paradox and survived by becoming integrated contradiction. Person who'd lived two timelines and held both as equally true despite their mutual exclusivity. And Lisa wondered how many other drivers had experienced similar intersections. How many had met their duplicates at delivery points where timelines crossed? How many carried multiple versions of their histories because reality had resolved paradoxes through merging rather than elimination? She looked at other drivers, wondering if they too were composite beings, carrying multiple timelines in single consciousness, living as walking paradoxes that reality had decided to accommodate rather than erase. Story 4. The Road That Ate Distance. Marcus Webb entered Interstate 70 in Kansas, driving eastbound toward Kansas City. And after 2 hours of driving, his GPS showed he'd made no forward progress, was still at the same coordinates where he'd entered the highway, and Marcus's odometer showed he'd covered 120 miles. But every mile marker he passed read the same number, and Marcus realized the highway was consuming distance, was eating the miles he drove, was a road that accepted travel but provided no progress toward destination. And if Marcus couldn't find a way to escape this distance-eating highway, he would drive forever without ever reaching anywhere. He'd been hauling agricultural equipment, standard Midwest delivery, routine route he'd driven dozens of times without incident. The phenomenon had been gradual, so subtle that Marcus hadn't noticed it initially. He'd been driving for about 45 minutes when he'd passed mile marker 315, and 15 minutes later when he'd checked for the next marker expecting 320 or so, he'd seen 315 again. Marcus had assumed he'd misread the first one, had continued driving, but when he'd passed 315 a third time, then a fourth, he'd known something was seriously wrong. His odometer was incrementing normally, showing miles accumulating, but the mile markers refused to change. Marcus was covering distance, his truck was consuming fuel at normal rate, time was passing normally, but he wasn't making geographic progress. The highway was eating his travel, consuming the miles he drove, keeping him perpetually at the same location despite continuous motion. Marcus had tried exiting the highway, taking the next off-ramp, but the ramp had looped back to I-70, deposited him back on the eastbound lanes exactly where he'd been. He'd tried the opposite exit with the same result. Every attempt to leave the highway failed, returned him to the distance-eating section, kept him trapped in the loop where travel occurred but progress did not. His GPS had confirmed the horror. His position wasn't updating, was frozen at the coordinates where he'd entered the affected section. According to the satellite data, Marcus wasn't moving at all, was stationary despite driving 65 miles per hour, despite covering miles according to his odometer, despite definitely being in motion relative to the road surface. Marcus had tried calling for help, but his phone calls wouldn't connect, his messages wouldn't send. He was isolated in a bubble of space where distance worked differently, where motion didn't translate to progress, where the highway consumed travel without providing destination. Other vehicles on the highway seemed unaffected, passing Marcus normally, exiting successfully, making visible progress toward their destinations. Only Marcus was trapped in the distance-eating section. Only his truck was caught in the loop where miles accumulated without geographic advancement. Marcus drove for 6 hours, covering nearly 400 miles according to his instruments, burning through most of his fuel but remaining at mile marker 315, stuck at the same geographic coordinates, trapped in space that accepted his motion but refused to let him move through it. He was caught in something like a cosmic treadmill, expending energy to travel but getting nowhere, driving eternally, without ever reaching the other side of Kansas. Panic set in as Marcus's fuel gauge approached empty. If he ran out of fuel while trapped in the distance-eating section, he'd be stranded forever, stuck at mile marker 315 with no way to escape, no way to call for help, no way to reach the destination that remained perpetually unreachable despite hours of driving toward it. Marcus tried everything he could think of. He drove backward, trying to reverse out of the affected section, but found himself still at mile marker 315, still trapped. He tried driving at different speeds, hoping velocity would affect the phenomenon, but whether he drove slowly or fast made no difference. The distance was still consumed, the progress still denied. He tried stopping completely, waiting to see if time would reset the trap. But after 30 minutes of idling at the roadside, when Marcus resumed driving, he was still at mile marker 315, still caught in the loop. His fuel was critically low now, maybe 15 minutes of driving remaining. Marcus made a desperate decision. He'd drive off-road, would leave the highway entirely by cutting across the median and driving through the prairie, bypassing the affected section by refusing to use the road at all. It was technically illegal, would damage his truck, might get him arrested. But it was the only option he could see for escaping the distance-eating highway. Marcus cranked his steering wheel, drove across the shoulder onto the median, felt his truck bounce over rough ground, and headed perpendicular to the highway. His GPS showed him moving now, finally making progress away from the trapped coordinates. Marcus continued across the open prairie for 2 miles, then paralleled the highway at a distance, driving through fields, following the interstate's direction without being on the interstate itself. Eventually, Marcus saw an exit ahead, drove cross-country to reach it, and merged back onto I-70 through the exit ramp. His GPS updated immediately, showing him 50 miles east of where he'd been trapped, showing that he'd finally escaped the distance-eating section. Marcus was free, was making normal progress again, was traveling through space that worked correctly. But his fuel tank was empty, had been running on fumes during his cross-country detour. Marcus coasted to the next exit, barely made it to a truck stop before his engine died completely. He refueled and sat in his cab for an hour, trying to process what had happened. Trying to understand how a section of interstate could eat distance, could trap a driver in perpetual travel without progress. Marcus completed his delivery to Kansas City 12 hours late. His explanations for the delay dismissed as ridiculous by his dispatcher. No one believed that he'd been trapped in a loop, that he'd covered 400 miles without making geographic progress, that he'd had to drive cross-country to escape a highway that consumed distance. His truck's GPS log showed the impossible journey, showed him stuck at one location for hours despite continuous motion. But investigators attributed this to equipment malfunction, to GPS error, to anything except the truth. Marcus Webb continued driving professionally, but he never took I-70 through Kansas again, added hundreds of miles to his routes to avoid that section of highway. And he heard reports from other drivers who'd experienced similar phenomena on different roads, who'd been trapped in distance-eating sections of highway, who'd driven for hours without making progress, who'd consumed entire tanks of fuel while remaining at the same mile markers. The distance-eating highways were real, were a phenomenon that affected certain sections of road under certain conditions, and drivers who encountered them faced impossible choices. Continue driving uselessly, consuming fuel without making progress, or take drastic action like Marcus's cross-country detour to escape the affected sections. Most drivers who got trapped simply ran out of fuel eventually, were found stranded at specific mile markers claiming they'd been driving for hours but hadn't moved. Their stories dismissed as confusion or medical emergencies rather than evidence of roads that could eat distance. Story 5. The Living Billboard. Catherine Park drove past the billboard on Highway 285 in New Mexico, and the advertisement showed a photograph of Catherine herself standing beside her truck, and the text read, "Catherine Park will die here tomorrow." And when Catherine stopped to photograph the impossible billboard to document this prediction of her death, the image updated now showed Catherine taking the photograph, the billboard reflecting her current action in real time. And Catherine realized the billboard was alive, was observing her, was predicting her future or determining it, and she had less than 24 hours to prevent the death the billboard had advertised. She'd been hauling manufactured goods from Albuquerque to El Paso, a route she knew well, and the billboard had been in location she'd passed many times but never noticed before. The image had been undeniably Catherine, not someone who looked similar, but her exact likeness, perfect detail down to the scar on her chin and the specific way she wore her hair. And the truck in the photograph was her truck, her exact rig with the same company logo and the same minor damage on the front bumper from a parking lot incident 6 months earlier. This was prediction specific to Catherine, message meant only for her. Catherine had pulled onto the shoulder, grabbed her phone, and photographed the billboard, needing evidence of this impossible prediction. But when she'd reviewed the photo, she'd seen the billboard had changed. Now it showed Catherine standing exactly where she was standing, holding her phone at exactly the angle she was holding it, taking the photograph she'd just taken. The billboard was updating in real time, was showing Catherine's immediate present, was observing her and displaying her actions instantaneously. She'd called the phone number on the billboard, the advertiser contact information, and reached a disconnected line. Number not in service. The billboard wasn't legitimate advertising, wasn't real commercial content, was something else entirely. Something that could observe and predict and display personalized death notices to its targets. Catherine had examined the billboard structure, looking for cameras or sensors that might explain its ability to observe her, but found nothing except normal billboard construction with the digital display showing her image. She'd waved at the billboard, and the image had showed her waving, confirming real-time observation. This wasn't pre-recorded prediction, this was active surveillance with precognitive capability. Infrastructure that could see the future and was using that ability to warn Catherine of her impending death. Or was it warning? Catherine wondered if the billboard was predicting her death or causing it, if by advertising her demise it was making it inevitable, was creating self-fulfilling prophecy. If Catherine tried to avoid the death, would she just drive herself toward it through her evasive actions? Or was the billboard giving her information she could use to survive, providing warning that allowed her to change her fate? Catherine had decided to trust the warning, to assume she could prevent the predicted death if she acted carefully. She'd continued driving toward El Paso, but with extreme vigilance, watching for hazards, avoiding risks, doing everything possible to ensure her survival through the next 24 hours. The billboard had said she'd die here, which Catherine interpreted as this section of highway, this general area. So she'd driven through it as quickly and safely as possible, putting distance between herself and the billboard's location. But every billboard Catherine passed after that showed her face, showed updated predictions. Catherine Park will die in 6 hours. Catherine Park will die at mile marker 73. Catherine Park's truck will experience brake failure. The living billboards were tracking her, updating their predictions, providing increasingly specific information about how and where she would die. Catherine had checked her brakes immediately after seeing that prediction, found them functioning normally. But she couldn't shake the fear that the billboard was right, that her brakes would fail and cause the fatal accident. She'd driven at reduced speed, avoided heavy traffic, and found a truck stop where she could have her brakes professionally inspected. The mechanic had found nothing wrong initially, but when he'd looked more carefully, he'd discovered a small hydraulic line had been deliberately cut almost through, would have failed catastrophically within the next few hours of driving, would have left Catherine with no brakes on a downhill section of highway. Someone had sabotaged her truck, had ensured the billboard's prediction would come true. When did this happen? Catherine had asked the mechanic. Recently, within the last few hours. This was done while you've been driving today, probably at one of your stops. Catherine felt cold wash over her. The billboard hadn't just predicted her death, it had arranged it. The entity or intelligence behind the living billboards wasn't warning victims, it was orchestrating their deaths, sabotaging vehicles, creating the fatal circumstances it advertised. The prediction was also the cause. Catherine had her brakes fully repaired, double-checked every system on her truck, and refused to stop anywhere until she'd completed her delivery to El Paso. She drove continuously, paranoid that any stop might give the billboard's operators opportunity to sabotage her vehicle again, to ensure the predicted death occurred despite her efforts to prevent it. The billboards continued updating, showing her current position, counting down time. Catherine Park has 4 hours. Catherine Park has 2 hours. Catherine Park has 30 minutes. But Catherine survived each predicted deadline, kept driving, kept evading the orchestrated death. And as she approached El Paso, as the countdown reached 0 and then continued past it, the billboard's messages changed. Catherine Park has escaped. Catherine Park broke prediction. Catherine Park lives. She'd done it. She'd survived past the predicted death time, had evaded the orchestrated accident, had broken the billboard's determination of her fate. Catherine completed her delivery to El Paso in a state of exhausted relief, having won a battle against infrastructure that tried to kill her, against predictive advertising that had arranged her death and failed to achieve it. But Catherine knew she'd been lucky, knew that other drivers had probably seen their own deaths advertised on living billboards and hadn't escaped, hadn't survived the orchestrated accidents and sabotaged vehicles. She reported the phenomenon to authorities, described the billboards that predicted deaths and then caused them. But her report was dismissed as stress-induced delusion, as impossible claims from a driver who'd experienced some kind of breakdown. Catherine Park quit long-haul trucking after that trip, couldn't handle driving past billboards anymore, couldn't shake the fear that any advertisement might suddenly display her face and death prediction. She'd survived one encounter with the living billboards, but she knew they were still out there, still observing drivers, still predicting deaths and orchestrating accidents, still functioning as infrastructure of death that operated under the guise of commercial advertising. And sometimes, driving through cities in her personal vehicle, Catherine would see billboards displaying faces of strangers with death predictions, with countdowns and locations and causes. She'd try to warn those people, try to find them and tell them they were targeted. But she never could locate them in time, and inevitably she'd see news reports of accidents matching the billboard predictions. Confirmation that the living advertisements were continuing their work, predicting and causing deaths, functioning as precognitive infrastructure of murder that no one in authority would acknowledge or investigate. Story 6. The Passenger Who Wouldn't Leave. Robert Chen picked up a hitchhiker outside Flagstaff, Arizona, a woman in her 30s who said her car had broken down and she needed a ride to the next truck stop. And Robert violated his personal rule against passengers because the woman looked desperate and the desert was dangerous at night. But when they reached the truck stop, when Robert pulled in and told her they'd arrived, the woman said, "I can't leave yet, we haven't reached my real destination." And Robert realized with growing horror that the passenger wasn't going to let him continue without her, was going to stay in his cab regardless of his wishes. And no matter what Robert tried, the woman remained, impossible to remove, claiming she'd tell him her real destination when they arrived there. And Robert was trapped driving with a passenger who existed but wouldn't leave and whose presence was making his reality increasingly unstable. The hitchhiker's name was Sarah, or at least that's what she'd said when Robert had picked her up, though now Robert suspected everything she'd told him was false. The first sign that something was wrong had been Sarah's reaction to reaching the truck stop. Instead of thanking Robert and exiting, she'd simply remained seated, looking straight ahead, saying in a flat voice, "This isn't where I need to go. We continue together." Robert had insisted she leave, had pointed out that this was the destination she'd requested. But Sarah had shown no interest in departing. Robert had tried to physically remove her, had grabbed her arm to guide her out of the cab, but his hand had passed through her, had encountered no resistance, like she wasn't quite solid. Sarah had looked at him and smiled, and Robert had seen something wrong in her expression, something that suggested she wasn't human despite appearing perfectly normal at first glance. "What are you?" Robert had asked, fear growing in his chest. "I'm a passenger. I'm something that needs to reach a specific destination, and you're going to take me there. You don't get to choose this, Robert. The moment you stopped for me, you became my driver. We're bound together until I reach where I need to go." Robert had climbed out of his truck, intending to call police to get help removing the unwanted passenger. But when he'd walked around to the passenger side door, when he'd opened it to prove Sarah was there to potential helpers, the seat had been empty. No passenger visible. Robert had looked inside, confused, and then he'd returned to the driver's side and seen Sarah still sitting in the passenger seat, visible from that angle but not from outside the truck. "Only you can see me," Sarah had explained. "To everyone else, you're alone in this cab, talking to empty air, trying to remove a passenger who doesn't exist. If you ask for help, Robert, they'll think you're having a mental health crisis. They'll call for psychiatric evaluation. Is that what you want?" Robert had realized she was right, had understood that trying to get help would only make him look insane. He was trapped with a passenger only he could perceive, an entity that had bound itself to his journey and wouldn't leave until it reached its unknown destination. "Where are you trying to go?" Robert had asked. "I'll know it when we arrive," Sarah had replied. "I need you to drive your normal routes, make your normal deliveries. Eventually we'll reach the place I need to be and then I'll leave. Until then, we're together." Robert had considered abandoning his truck, walking away from the whole situation, but Sarah had pointed out that would end his career, would leave him with no income, no way to support himself. "Just drive, Robert, do your job. Pretend I'm not here if it helps. Eventually this will end." So Robert had driven, continuing his route toward Phoenix with Sarah sitting silently beside him, an impossible passenger who existed only for him, who couldn't be removed and wouldn't leave voluntarily. He tried to ignore her, to focus on driving, but her presence was oppressive, made the cab feel crowded, made Robert constantly aware that something wrong was sharing his space. Days passed. Robert completed his Phoenix delivery, picked up a new load, drove to Los Angeles, then Sacramento, then Portland, and Sarah remained, never sleeping, never eating, never showing any human needs. She just sat in the passenger seat watching the road, occasionally saying things like "not yet" or "we're getting closer" or "continue north." Robert's mental state deteriorated under the strain of having a permanent passenger who others couldn't see. He started talking to Sarah, arguing with her, demanding she tell him where she needed to go. She refused, insisted she'd recognize the destination when they arrived, couldn't describe it in advance. Robert felt like he was going insane, felt like the isolation of having an invisible passenger was destroying his grip on reality. Other drivers noticed Robert talking to himself, noticed him gesturing at empty air, and word spread through the trucking community that Robert Chen was having problems, was maybe not safe to be on the road. Robert's dispatcher received complaints, started questioning Robert's fitness to drive, and Robert couldn't explain without sounding mentally ill that he had a passenger who wouldn't leave. 2 weeks into Sarah's presence, Robert's truck was pulled over by highway patrol for erratic driving. The officer had asked if Robert was under the influence, had looked inside the cab and seen no passenger, had been confused by Robert's insistence that someone was sitting there. Robert had been given a field sobriety test, had passed, but the officer had been concerned enough to recommend Robert get medical evaluation. Robert had continued driving because he didn't know what else to do, because stopping meant admitting defeat, because he hoped eventually Sarah would reach her destination and leave. But Sarah remained, week after week, month after month, an impossible passenger who had bound herself to Robert's truck and wouldn't depart. Robert's life fell apart around him. His company fired him for erratic behavior. His family became concerned about his mental health. His friends stopped answering his calls. Robert was alone except for Sarah, isolated with the passenger who wouldn't leave, driven toward a destination he didn't know. Finally, after 3 months of Sarah's presence, Robert's truck broke down in Montana, mechanical failure that left him stranded on a remote highway. As Robert sat in his dead truck waiting for help, Sarah spoke clearly for the first time in weeks. "This is it. This is where I needed to be. Thank you for bringing me here, Robert." "What is this place?" Robert asked. "Why did you need to come to a random stretch of Montana highway?" "This is where I died," Sarah said quietly. 40 years ago, I was killed in an accident on this exact spot. My body was never found, was thrown from the vehicle and buried in the snow, and I've been trying to return ever since. I couldn't do it alone, needed someone to carry me here, and you were the driver who stopped for me. Now I can rest. Now I can finally be at the place where my life ended. Sarah faded then, her form becoming translucent, and Robert watched as she stepped out of his cab and walked to the side of the highway, stood at a specific spot, and disappeared completely. The oppressive presence lifted. The cab felt empty for the first time in 3 months, and Robert was alone again, truly alone. Help arrived, Robert's truck was repaired, and he drove away from that Montana highway with the understanding that he'd been used, had been a vehicle for a ghost trying to return to her death site. Sarah had bound herself to him, had forced him to drive until they reached the location she couldn't reach alone, and then she'd departed, leaving Robert with destroyed career and shattered reputation as the cost of her return. Robert Chen never drove professionally again, couldn't handle the fear that picking up another passenger might result in another months-long haunting, another entity binding itself to his journey for purposes he couldn't control. He'd learned that some passengers couldn't be removed, that some riders imposed themselves on drivers and stayed until they reached their destinations, and that the cost of being charitable, of stopping for hitchhikers in need, might be hosting ghosts that wouldn't leave until they'd achieved their purposes, however long that took and however much damage it caused to the driver's life. Story 7. The Thing Beneath the Ice. We drilled through 6 feet of lake ice for our fishing shack, but something was already down there waiting, and it had been scratching on the underside of the ice for decades, trying to get out. My name is Patricia Sims, and I'd been working as a fishing guide on Lake Clark for 8 winters, taking tourists out to ice fishing camps, teaching them how to drill holes and set lines and wait for the trout and char that thrived in the deep, cold water. It was good money, reliable work in a state where winter employment could be hard to find, and I loved the isolation of the frozen lake, the silence that came with being miles from shore on 6 feet of solid ice, the sense of being suspended between the frozen surface and the dark water below, existing in a temporary space that would melt away come spring. This season, I'd set up a new fishing shack about 3 miles from my usual location, trying to find less pressured fishing grounds where the trout hadn't learned to avoid our lures. The ice was thick and solid, frozen since November, now in late February at its maximum thickness before the spring melt would begin. I'd brought my power auger, drilled 4 holes in a square pattern inside the shack, each hole 10 inches in diameter, dropping through the ice into the black water below. Standard setup, standard procedure, nothing unusual about the process until the 4th hole broke through and I heard the sound. It was scratching. Rhythmic, deliberate scratching coming from beneath the ice, from somewhere in the water below my shack. At first I thought it was the auger bit dragging against ice as I pulled it up, metal scraping against the frozen surface. But the sound continued after I'd removed the auger completely, continued after I'd set it aside and was kneeling by the hole looking down into the dark water. Scratch, 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 like fingernails on wood or claws on stone or something hard and determined dragging against the underside of the ice trying to find a way through. I shone my flashlight down the hole, watched the beam penetrate maybe 15 feet into the water before being swallowed by darkness and particulate. Lake Clark was deep here, maybe 200 feet, the bottom far beyond where light could reach. But the scratching wasn't coming from the bottom, it was coming from directly beneath the ice, from the frozen layer just below my feet, like something was positioned right under the surface, right below where I was kneeling, separated from me by only 6 feet of ice and the 10-inch hole I'd just drilled. I stood up, backed away from the hole, tried to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe ice expansion, thermal stress causing the frozen layer to crack and shift. Maybe air bubbles trapped in the ice moving and creating acoustic effects. Maybe imagination amplifying normal sounds into something threatening. But the scratching continued, steady and purposeful, and gradually I realized it wasn't random. It had a pattern. 3 scratches, pause, 3 scratches, pause, 3 scratches. Like something was signaling, communicating, trying to make contact through the ice. I should have left immediately. Should have abandoned the shack and the holes in the entire location. Should have snowmobiled back to shore and found a different fishing ground. But 8 years of working on this lake had made me confident, had made me believe I understood this environment, had made me dismiss threats as unlikely in a place I considered familiar and safe. So instead, I went to my gearbox, pulled out my underwater camera, the kind we use to scout fish populations and show tourists what was below the ice. Lowered it down the hole on its tethered cable, watched the small monitor screen as the camera descended into darkness. For the first 10 feet, I saw normal lake environment, suspended particulate, the occasional small fish darting past, the gray-green murk of winter water. Then at about 15 feet, the camera's light illuminated the underside of the ice layer around my shack, showing the irregular frozen surface from below, icicles pointing downward into the water, formations created by the freezing process. And there, positioned directly beneath where I stood, was something that shouldn't exist. It was humanoid, but wrong, impossibly preserved in the frozen layer. Not beneath the ice, but within it, trapped in the matrix of frozen water like an insect in amber. The body, I couldn't call it anything else, was impossibly old. Skin weathered to leather, clothes rotted to fragments, but the form was intact, complete, showing no signs of decomposition despite what must have been years or decades of preservation. It was positioned with its arms extended upward, hands pressed against the ice from below. Fingers splayed like it was pushing, trying to break through, frozen in the act of attempting escape. And the hands were moving. Not much, maybe a quarter inch, but definitely moving. Fingers flexing slowly, scratching against the ice from within the frozen layer, creating the sounds I'd been hearing. The thing was alive somehow, conscious somehow, trapped in ice for an impossible amount of time, but still animate, still trying to break through. Still scratching at the frozen barrier that held it suspended between the lake water and the surface air. I pulled the camera up fast, yanked it out of the hole with shaking hands, stared at the monitor screen showing the last frame before I'd pulled it free. The thing's face tilted upward, eyes open and clouded but somehow tracking the camera, mouth slightly open showing teeth that were too sharp, too numerous, too wrong to be human despite the humanoid shape of the skull. Whatever was trapped in the ice had been human once, or looked human or wanted me to think it had been human, but the details betrayed its true nature as something else, something that used human form as camouflage or convenience or cruel mimicry. The scratching intensified. I could hear it clearly now without the camera, could hear it coming not just from the hole I'd been investigating, but from all around the shack. From every direction, like the entire ice sheet beneath me was filled with these things, all of them positioned under the surface, all of them scratching and pushing and trying to break through the frozen layer that held them. The floor of my shack vibrated with their efforts, ice conducting the sound and fury of their trapped struggle, transmitting their desperate attempts at escape directly into my feet, into my bones, into my consciousness that was starting to understand I'd set up my fishing camp directly above something that should have stayed undiscovered. I grabbed my emergency pack, abandoned everything else, the shack, the gear, the expensive auger and camera equipment, and ran for my snowmobile parked 50 yards away on the safe ice away from the holes. Behind me, I heard something change in the quality of the scratching. Heard it become more intense, more focused. Heard it concentrate on the holes I'd drilled, the 10-inch openings that represented the weakest points in the frozen barrier, The places where the thing trapped in ice might be able to push through if it tried hard enough, if it focused its efforts, if it had been waiting decades for someone to drill holes directly above its frozen prison. I was 20 yards from the snowmobile when I heard the ice crack. Not a normal thermal crack, not the booming sound of expansion that ice makes when temperature shifts. This was different, sharper, more localized. The sound of ice failing under direct pressure from below. I looked back at my shack and saw it tilting, sagging, the ice beneath it compromising as something pushed up from underneath. As the holes I'd drilled became conduits for catastrophic failure, as the frozen layer that had held those things trapped for however long they'd been down there finally gave way under their concentrated assault. The ice around the shack collapsed, creating a rough circle maybe 15 feet in diameter, the fishing shack dropping through into the black water below. And from the broken ice emerged hands, dozens of them, hundreds of them, all pushing up from the dark water, all clawing at the edges of the hole, all trying to pull themselves out of the lake and onto the frozen surface. They were human-shaped but wrong, fingers too long, nails too sharp, skin too pale and waterlogged to belong to anything that had died recently. These things had been down there for a long time, trapped in ice, trapped in water, trapped in whatever state between life and death allowed them to remain conscious and animate while frozen solid. I reached my snowmobile, keyed the ignition, gunned the throttle without warming the engine, didn't care about proper procedure or equipment safety, only cared about distance between me and the collapsing ice and the things crawling out of the hole I'd created. The snowmobile caught on the second try, engine racing, track biting into the hard-packed snow on top of the ice. I accelerated toward shore 3 miles away, didn't look back, didn't slow down, didn't stop until I reached the rocky beach and solid ground that wasn't frozen water hiding impossible things. From shore, I finally looked back at the lake, at the location where my shack had been, at the dark spot on the white expanse that marked where the ice had failed. Even from 3 miles away, I could see movement around the hole, could see things on the surface that might have been rocks or ice chunks or the things I'd released, spreading out across the frozen lake, exploring their freedom after decades of frozen imprisonment. I reported the incident to Alaska State Troopers, told them there was an ice failure on Lake Clark, that my fishing shack had gone through, that the ice was unstable in that area. Didn't mention the things I'd seen, the humanoid forms trapped in ice, the hands emerging from the dark water. Didn't think anyone would believe me, didn't think I believed it myself. Wanted to categorize the entire experience as exhaustion or altitude or carbon monoxide from the shack's heater affecting my perception. But 2 days later, a trooper called me back. They'd sent a helicopter to scout the area, assess the ice damage, determine if the lake needed to be closed to ice fishing for safety reasons. The pilot had seen something unusual at the collapse site. Bodies on the ice, multiple bodies arranged in a circle around the hole, all of them appearing to be very old, very weathered, possibly recovered from the lake bottom when the ice failed. They'd sent a recovery team out on snowmobiles to collect the remains, to identify them if possible, to determine how long they'd been in the water. The recovery team never made it back. The helicopter went out 6 hours later when they didn't report in, found the snowmobiles abandoned on the ice near the collapse site. Found no sign of the 3-person recovery team. Found no bodies despite the pilot's clear report of seeing multiple remains from the air earlier that day. What they did find was more holes in the ice, dozens of them ranging in size from a few inches to several feet across, all of them appearing to have been opened from below, punched through by something pushing up from the water, creating access points from the dark lake into the winter air above. Lake Clark was closed to all recreational activity for the remainder of the winter. Official reason was ice instability, risk of catastrophic failure, public safety concerns. But I talked to the helicopter pilot off the record, bought him drinks at a bar in Anchorage, got him to tell me what he'd really seen during that second flight. He described bodies moving on the ice, described them standing and walking and gathering near the holes. Described them looking up at the helicopter with faces that were human-shaped but empty, expressions that were blank but somehow aware, movements that were jerky and wrong but definitely purposeful. Like people who'd forgotten how to be people but were trying to remember, were practicing. Were learning to mimic human behavior after spending decades frozen in ice, forgetting what humanity looked like. He described one of them waving at the helicopter. A slow, deliberate wave. A gesture that might have been greeting or might have been warning or might have been something else entirely. Some communication from things that had been trapped and now were free. That had been patient and now were active. That had been waiting beneath the ice for someone to drill holes and create access, and give them the opportunity they'd needed to escape their frozen prison. I never went back to Lake Clark, quit guiding that spring, moved to Fairbanks, found work that kept me away from frozen lakes and ice fishing and anywhere that required drilling holes in frozen surfaces. But I follow the news from that area, watch for reports of unusual activity, track incidents that might be related to what I released that February day when my auger broke through ice that should have stayed solid. There have been disappearances, 7 people over 3 years, all of them near Lake Clark, all of them in winter, all of them vanishing from frozen lake surfaces without trace or explanation. Search parties find snowmobiles abandoned, find gear scattered on ice, find holes drilled or broken in the frozen surface, but no bodies, no evidence of where the missing people went. Just empty ice and open water and the sense that something is taking them. Something is pulling them down through the holes into the dark water below. Something that remembers being trapped and now makes others experience the same frozen imprisonment it endured for decades beneath the ice. The elders in the local villages have stories about the things in Lake Clark, stories that go back generations. Stories about hunters who fell through ice and didn't drown, didn't die, but instead were changed by the deep, cold water, were transformed into something that could survive freezing, that could remain conscious while trapped in ice, that became neither alive nor dead but something in between, something that waited at the bottom of the lake for opportunities to return to the surface, to reclaim the humanity they'd lost. To hunt the living the way they'd been hunted by cold and water and the pitiless environment that had taken their lives and twisted them into something new. The stories say the lake has always had these things, that they're part of the ecosystem like the fish and the water itself, that they serve some purpose in the balance between living and dead, between frozen and flowing, between the surface world and the deep darkness where normal rules don't apply. The stories say you can hear them scratching if you listen carefully when you drill through lake ice. Scratching at the underside of the frozen barrier, trying to make contact, trying to signal that they're down there, that they're waiting, that they remember what it was like to walk on top of the ice instead of being trapped beneath it. I hear scratching sometimes, even now, even hundreds of miles from Lake Clark. Even in my Fairbanks apartment where there's no ice nearby, no frozen lakes, no dark water hiding impossible things. I hear it at night mostly, that rhythmic pattern. 3 scratches, pause, 3 scratches, pause, coming from my walls or my floor or somewhere I can't locate. The sound of something trapped trying to get through, something patient trying to make contact. Something that followed me from that lake and hasn't stopped trying to reach me even though I ran, even though I left, even though I abandoned everything to escape what I'd released. The scratching is getting louder, getting closer. And sometimes I wonder if the ice that trapped those things wasn't geographical, wasn't limited to Lake Clark, wasn't about frozen water at all. Sometimes I wonder if the ice is metaphorical, if it's the barrier between their world and ours, if drilling holes in frozen lakes is just one way to breach that barrier, if there are other ways they can cross over, other methods they can use to move from where they're trapped into where we think we're safe. Sometimes I wonder if I brought them with me when I fled, if they attached themselves somehow, If they're scratching their way through barriers I can't see, getting closer each night, preparing to emerge from whatever frozen state holds them separate from our reality. And sometimes, late at night when the scratching is loudest, I wonder if I'm already trapped with them, already frozen in some way I don't recognize, already changed into something that only thinks it's still Patricia Sims, still human, still alive, when really I'm down beneath the ice with all the other things that scratch and wait and call to the living, trying to lure them down to where we exist now, in the cold and the dark and the spaces between frozen and flowing where the things from Lake Clark make their home. The scratching continues, 3 times, then pause, 3 times, then pause, like something counting down, like something measuring distance, like something very close to breaking through.